Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Curmudgeonly Conversation. Tonight, we continue our series of invigorating conversations with outstanding guests by chatting with Andrew Nappi, the globally famous Florida Tenther, a great liberty defender and Tea Party activist for a number of years now. And we're going to get the perspective of somebody who's been on the ground as a political activist in the Tea Party movement, in the nullification movement, in the fight for liberty, in the state of Florida, and what it's like on the ground doing the things that Andrew has done, and to see if we can learn some things that might be helpful to others as we go forward, and also get his thoughts on philosophy and on some of the events of the day. As we've mentioned previously, Curmudgeonly Conversation is available at ji1776.com, also at the Cerberus Radio Network, thanks to the efforts of our good friend Suzanne Sherman, and soon to be available at the Libertarian Institute. So we're very excited about all that availability. Ladies and gentlemen, our good friend from Florida, Andrew Nappi. Andrew, how are you?
Well, fine, Dennis. Thanks for having me on. I am indeed an old curmudgeonly fellow.
Oh, very, very good. So yes, curmudgeon to curmudgeon, we'll have a conversation. So you're down there in Florida, and I know you do a lot of wonderful work as the Florida Tenther. You've been very involved in the nullification movement, among other things. And you're also quite familiar with the Tea Party movement, having been involved in that. And I see that, particularly lately, of interest, some of your observations regarding the Tea Party movement and what might have happened to it during the Trump administration. And so I'm curious as to your thoughts about that, Andrew. And are we at a spot where one has to make a decision between Tea Party and Trump Party, or do those two things go together, or what are your thoughts?
Well, I started in Florida actually with the Birch Society. And I was with the Birchers when that Tea Party movement started. And I was never part of a Tea Party group per se, but during that era, initially, just coming right out of the box, I saw that there was going to be a problem with it, Dennis, because at the first rally that was here locally, was at a mall, and there were hundreds of people. And I noticed that the head of the local Republican club was there in full colonial regalia with his tri-cornered hat. And I said to myself, this is going to be co-opted very soon, if it isn't already. And sure enough, within 6 or 7 months, the Republican Party, co-opted that nascent Tea Party movement. And it's, as you can tell, with the budget and $21 trillion in debt, nobody cares about tax enough already or fiscal responsibility, which was one of the foundations of that particular movement.
Yes. Now, would this have been in the 2007, 2008 time frame, or a few years after that, or what time frame was this when you were at that rally?
This was in 2009.
Okay. Well, that is interesting. The Tea Party initially got started. Really, it was part of the Ron Paul campaign.
Ron Paul revolution, right? Yes.
Right. Those Ron Paul money bombs. So folks might find that interesting. And then it tailed off a little bit after the 2008 election until Rick Santelli hit his famous rant on CNBC, and then it perked up again. And so that probably is about that 2009 timeframe that you're referring to. And there was concern that it would become an AstroTurf rather than a grassroots situation, with the Republican Party taking it over, and that does appear to be what has happened to a large degree. And we see what would have been the principles of the Tea Party then and the original Tea Partiers back during American Revolutionary Patriot times, and how do those coincide with what's happening with the Trump administration, and how would they be different? And it seems like there's quite a divergence there.
Well, there is
in a number of ways, and there's been some interesting work written by Ryan McMakin from the Mises Institute. He's put out 2 pieces here over the last week, I think, addressing this. And in fact, I know you saw one of them, the later one today, and he's saying how he said conservatives, but he said some conservatives find freedom to be unpatriotic. And then, of course, our friend Mike Meharry has written about, among others, he's written about the deficit situation and how even though we've had increased revenues, the spending is going out of control. And, and and then, of course, there's the whole issue with gun rights and the increased gun rights infringement, which is higher now under the Trump administration than it was under the Obama administration. But you have a lot of these people that used to be who call themselves Tea Partiers who don't want us mentioning that. Are you noticing a similar thing, Andrew?
Oh, absolutely. Here in Florida, as you know, we've had since 2018 red flag law. And red flag law was written by the Republicans in the state legislature. In fact, the designated Republican Florida Senate President, Wilton Simpson, in his campaign flyers in 2018, he bragged about writing the law. And they wrote it, they passed it, they are the majority in our legislature, and a Republican governor signed it into law. And that Republican governor, by the way, is now a senator in the United States Senate, where he champions red flag law on a national basis.
Oh, is that Rick Scott?
That's Rick Scott, yes, sir.
Wow. And your other senator is Marco Rubio.
Yeah, the original Tea Party darling, Marco Rubio, who never. It's used in jest, but he's never lived up to any of the principles of the founders of the Declaration of Independence. You know, Dennis, the Declaration of Independence is a list of civil liberties grievances. There's 8 words: taxation without representation, but the rest of it is a declaration of grievances on civil liberties, which many are, again, in practice today. And that is legislation that has been supported and advanced by these same Republicans that have been in office since the Patriot Act has been enacted.
Well, and many of them favored that. In fact, I think I remember seeing something that some commentary that you had that was right on target, Andrew. Talk about another Florida Republican, Alan West.
Exactly.
And I think you had some commentary about how what Alan West was doing was hostile to the rights of Americans, and may have been, I say may have been in quotes, I'm understating it here, contrary to the oath of office that's taken. So perhaps you can share some of your thoughts regarding that, and then also this idea that not only at the federal level, but as we're seeing at the state level, and again, this is something that Mike Meharry at the 10th Amendment Center wrote about. I think perhaps it was Michael Bolden, now that I'm thinking, but one of the two of them brought up the point that not only are we seeing increased violations of the Second Amendment under this new administration, the current administration, as opposed to the previous one, which would be surprising to many people, and some don't even want to acknowledge it, but also we're seeing that Republicans at the state legislative level have not taken up the defense of these rights as they are duty bound to do. What your thoughts there, sir?
Well, it's certainly happening in Florida. There's a need in this particular legislative session coming up in 2020. Right now, they're having their what they call committee weeks, which is leading up to the 2020 session, and the Florida Senate is just they're obsessed with having to do something. They need to do something with more gun reform. So they have a position that nothing is off the table. And some of the things that Republicans are proposing are universal background checks, raising the age to buy a semi-automatic rifle to 25 years of age. So they have what they've done. To me, if I look at it, they've been so wishy-washy for years that as the left gets more emboldened, they get caught in that gravitational pull. So rather than stake out territory, plant their feet firmly, they get pulled by that gravitational pull of an ever leftward drift. And to me, that's when that happens, because you don't have any principles, because your whole purpose is to get elected for another season. And we're seeing it. I mean, it's happening right before our very eyes. And you made a good point before. People don't want to see it. I spent a week putting the pictures and names up of every Republican in the Florida legislature that voted for red flag law. And there's a lot of people refuse to believe it. And they will actually say, we need to get more Republicans in office. Well, the Republicans are destroying our gun rights here in Florida. And they need very little help from the Democrats. They're the majority party.
Wow. Well, that is interesting. Well, we see that oftentimes in Michigan too, where the Michigan Republicans will do things that you think, gee, we wouldn't expect that from them. We thought they were going to take a different approach, and yet they seem to be in cahoots, whether it's on raising gas taxes,
Mm-hmm.
or enabling Obamacare. And of course, this isn't true for all of them, and some of them do fine work, at least on some of the issues, some of the time. But even on the Obamacare expansion, for instance, we successfully nullified the healthcare exchange, and so that was one thing. And then Medicaid expansion came up, and that was actually temporarily stopped for a little bit, and then the governor threw a temper tantrum, the Republican governor, and very good. And so he did that, and then one thing led to another, and the Medicaid expansion went through, and of course now that looks like that's going to be a fiscal disaster for the state and for the other states that have done that. So sometimes people just throw their hands up, when you look at this,
We haven't expanded Medicaid here yet, and we also did not go with the Obamacare exchanges. But in his last year, Scott was getting softer on that. He was starting to look more fondly at possibly expanding Medicaid. But I think his last year, well, probably his whole life, but his last year, certainly his last 2 years, a lot of his actions were geared with his Senate run. He had his eyes on the U.S. Senate, and he had to play more to the middle because he was another one that came on board. Nationally, he was known as the Tea Party governor. And over the course of 8 years, he became more and more moderate. And in that last year, he was looking more longingly at some of these quote unquote reforms. It's one of the things that Republicans are great at is they don't repeal anything. They reform it. They want to repeal and replace. Like Ron Paul says, just repeal, no replace. We don't need anything to replace this stuff. But they're a repeal and replace organization. I ask people when they use the word rhino, point to me in the history of the Republican Party since 1854, the high bar against which you are measuring someone that you call a rhino. Show me historically where that is.
Yeah. Well, and my friend Chad Stevens, you might know Chad. He's from Sault Ste. Marie, the sage from the Sioux. He's a very brilliant guy, wonderful fellow, and he makes that same point. And John here has made that point. Who are the real rhinos? And of course, sometimes and unfortunately, the Republican Party, I guess there's been this fight over is it going to be a pro-liberty party or a big government party? But I think even at the beginning, that was a fight. There were people that were, because they were genuinely, the actual free soilers and some of the others. And then you had the other group, the corporatists, if you will. And of course, the first Republican president was their man. Mm-hmm. And so he took the Republican Party in that direction. And then there have been some others who have tried over the years to make it a more pro-liberty party with some success at times. But it looks like it's quite daunting. And, Gary North wrote an interesting piece a number of years ago when Dr. Paul was running for president. And he said, well, no, Dr. Paul's not going to get the nomination. And he said, there's all that skullduggery and all the cheating that went on. But he said there's another factor, too, which is ever since the Council on Foreign Relations was founded, we'll call it the Eastern Liberal Establishment, I guess, like Barry Goldwater used to call it, right?
Sure.
But he said, you've only had 2 Republicans get the nomination that they didn't want to get the nomination. And one was Goldwater, and a bunch of them did everything they could to sink his campaign. And the next one was Reagan, and the Reagan group and the Bush CFR group, he said, basically made an accommodation. they said, well, let's see if we can work together on this, and he said, but they basically co-opted Reagan in many ways in a lot of things that went on there in that administration. Not totally, but largely. So
Well, Reagan talked like a great libertarian,
yep.
but the actions on the ground were not a resemblance of what he was saying.
Well, and we see this frequently, right? In fact, I just saw somebody saying that Republicans often campaign as libertarians and govern as Democrats, and then Michael Bolden was commenting, this thing, and I had just used this line in church, and then I went home and saw him refute it. But this idea, I think Hayek was the one that said it first, or one of the ones that said it first, Friedrich von Hayek, which is that conservatives don't go in the other direction of progressives; they just make it a stick to a speed limit, or try to do that. But you're still giving up freedom, and it's just a matter of time. And so then you try to explain to people you need to have solid fundamentals, the principles. You need to advocate them and be uncompromising, like Ludwig von Mises, as a for instance, or Murray Rothbard, men like that.
Right.
And Dr. Ron Paul, and you might be unpopular. People might make fun or make life more difficult for you. But if we don't have those who will be heroic and stand up like that, then what happens is what you've noticed and what you remarked upon, which is the Democrats move left and the Republicans move left. And frankly, I think there's many ways in which you could look at the Trump administration. There's a few exceptions to this. There's some policy areas where this doesn't fit. But largely, his agenda seems to be that of the big spending, gun grabbing, central planning liberal New York Democrats of the 1990s, with some exceptions. There are a few areas where you say, well, here's something where that wouldn't fit that, but and yet then you compare it to these Democrats that are running for the nomination, and you could be left with the conclusion that the Trump administration in many areas is doing everything it can to push out anybody that wants liberty, and then the Democrats are trying to push you back in because you see how horrific they are, and some people say, well, I got to do something, So, what is that one does? Is it that sort of thing? The partisan politics, obviously, it leaves a lot to be desired and may be very destructive. And as Michael Bolden said, actually, often the Republicans are worse than the Democrats when you see the actual results, interestingly.
Well, they are. I mean, if you look at, you mentioned Alan West earlier. Alan West makes this big speech that Obama, Nancy Pelosi, and the whole gang of them should move out of the country. And then that same week, he votes with them on NDAA. He votes with them on the Federal Home and Grounds Improvement Act. Just a slew of war on terror legislation that it would be a total anathema to the Declaration of Independence grievances, but yet, they should get out of the country. And I think what you find with people like Colonel West and with people like Donald Trump, they find strains that will resonate with people, and then they go for that. Trump, to me, I love that we're getting troops out of Syria. I think that's great. I hope he continues and gets them out of everywhere, bring them home. I think his instincts on that are very good. But, things like tax cuts, people have told me, well, you could say what you want. I'm enjoying my tax cut. Well, you're going to pay for it because essentially he gave you a tax cut with your own money because we didn't cut any spending. So it basically went on a credit card. It's the same effect. And at his very core, he's a New York liberal who is a populist. And as you know, populism is not an ideology. It's a strategy. So let me find what resonates in this group that I've chosen and go after that. So hence you hear the hammering on immigration. You hear the hammering on build a wall, all of these things that are resonating with people. But he's not a liberty guy. And I would venture to say that the Trump administration, not that they set out to do this, but I think the cult of personality worship has really decimated the liberty movement as you and I understood it to be, because so many people, and I don't get how you go from Ron Paul to Donald Trump, but there's just so many people that have done that. I don't know how you hold to one and then make that shift to Donald Trump. It's very perplexing to me.
Right. Well, and of course, during the campaign, he some of his rhetoric was very, very anti-war. There were some other things that were very hawkish, but he you say his instincts seem to be pretty good on a lot of this stuff. The results, again, you look at his policy towards Russia, for instance, it's been diametrically opposed to what he said it was going to be. And then the situation of Saudi Arabia and Yemen is maddening and horrific. And
$750 billion defense budget.
yeah. Well, and that's probably understanding it, right? All in is probably $1 trillion or more, all the effects of it. But on the Syria thing, it looks like he's moving in the right direction there. And I did see something today. Somebody said, well, he said he's going to get the troops out of Syria, but then redeploy them to the Middle East. And building on the thing that as you said, and as Ron Paul would say, don't redeploy them, bring them home.
Bring them
home.
home.
Get out of the Middle East.
Yeah.
But, at least he's going in the right direction on Syria. I mean, he seems to recognize a lot of that.
Yeah, and I applaud that. I think going to North Korea was a great step. I think trying through back channels to reach out to the Iranians is another great step. But putting U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia, that's not a good plan. That's
horrible.
Yeah, that's horrible. But I look at the guy and I think of what Tom Woods said in his interview with Reason magazine. He's a mile wide and an inch deep.
Well, and the other Tom Woodsism on this is, oftentimes it seems that no matter who you vote for, we get John McCain in the White House.
McCain.
Or those policies.
Yes,
and then pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal and these horrible sanctions. That's a huge negative. But he at least seems to do some things, and to question a lot of the assumptions of the warmongers and the establishment. And yet, sadly, when you talk about the swamp, often you have to wonder, is he draining the swamp or swamping the drain? When you look at the budgets for all the military industrial complex, all that corporate welfare that goes in there and all that, and for the surveillance state and that sort of thing. But there have been other areas where, he did sign, the national right to try legislation. I mean, that was a good thing. Pardon the Oregon ranchers, that was a good thing. But again, so you can find a number of things where you'd say, well, these are unlikely for most presidents, and so he gets some kudos for that. But there's a lot of areas where he's made things worse. Maybe he'll get back on the foreign policy closer to what he talked about during the campaign. But also, you wonder again, are his gut instincts liberty or the authoritarianism? And on the trade issue, go back to the Tea Party. I think it's interesting, this idea that and this is not something he innovated. So it's a systemic problem. It's not one person. We always talk about the guy in the White House. The problem is systemic. And we have one person dictating on the tariffs, for instance, and what free people would agree to that? And was that what they ratified? No, but it's just what's going on now. There was a legislation passed, but that doesn't trump the Constitution, or make it right to violate the rights of others as to who they want to buy and sell with and on what terms and that sort of thing. But you think back to the original Tea Party. Here's I think an interesting little nuance that probably isn't talked about enough. Is in Boston, at least, what they were mad at was not an increase in the tax on tea. It was a decrease. Why were they mad at the decrease? Because the Hancock, they were smugglers running contraband because there was a prohibition against Dutch tea. And when they lowered the tax on the British tea, that hurt the profit margin of the smugglers of the Dutch tea. And so you could say maybe it was really a protest against prohibition and government telling you what you could or could not consume. I think that's an interesting aspect of it, don't you?
I think our generation has a lot of the blame to take for this, because we were all Thomas Jefferson when Obama was in office. We were all with, and I say we in a rhetorical sense, everybody was behind Daddy Bush in the invasion of Iraq the first time. Behind W when he went, and we had, if we don't fight them over there, we'll fight them over here, and all this war propaganda. And people are not acquainted with separation of powers. They don't realize how sacred that is in our system of government. And so we have an executive now that has been, quote unquote, given powers by Congress, like the War Powers Act, the ability to enact trade unilaterally, but the Constitution doesn't give Congress the authority to create more powers for the president. And yet we have it, and when you say something, what you get back is, well, if Congress won't do something, somebody has to. Well, that somebody isn't the president. The somebody is you to get Congress to do something. So, do we want a king? Is that what we want? Do we want an all-powerful executive? Is that we want somebody that can just take funds, redirect them at will, that can, declare war at will, use the military at will without any declaration of war, to make any trade agreement he wants, to apply any tariff he wants? What do we do? Why don't we just do away with any limitations on government and say, you know what? We've got a president from now on, and he is the unilateral power. And he can have consent or he cannot have consent. But as long as it's my guy, he can do whatever he wants. Because, in effect, that's what we have. To me, what is going on here, I think the founders would be rolling in their graves. The ratifiers would be rolling in their graves. Patrick Henry, wherever he is, he's got to be saying, "I told you so." He just has to be saying, "I told you so." And it's unfortunate because so many people, they're tuned into 24/7 cable. They never shut it off. And it's either One American News Network or it's Fox News Network or MSNBC. And that shapes their point of view. When they're in the car, they've got Hannity or Limbaugh on. And that reinforces them. They live in an echo chamber. So whatever those guys say how government should run, that's what they listen to. They end up with a bumper sticker education. And they're not listening to Michael Bolden's broadcast 3 times a week. They're not reading 10th Amendment Center. They're not reading Professor Gutzman. They're not reading Tom Woods. They're not reading Law and Liberty. They're not educating themselves. They're just accepting what their echo chamber is telling them. And therefore, when you do that incrementally over time, we lose the government that we were supposed to have. We lose liberty because no one understands that we are losing it, and therefore they can't defend it. And the people have to take the blame for that. They have to take the blame. They need to stop venting on social media and actually get out there and do something.
Well, there's that, and also to do the studies, and then our friend Mark Kreslins is leading the way with this idea that we need to again mention the Declaration of Independence. Go back to those principles. Go back to what Jefferson wrote about. I mean, one thing you could say about that as well. He wrote that we have inalienable rights granted by our Creator, and so, well, if we all believe that, and people will say, "Oh yeah, I believe that," the politicians, "Oh yeah, that's great stuff." Okay, well, if they're inalienable rights, then why are they being put up for a vote, a roll of the dice, and violated on a serial basis, and very little seems to be done about that sort of thing. And the other part is, he says, you have the right to alter and abolish government, and Mark and others are pointing out, if you look at the long train of abuses that we have today, and compare it to what they had in 1776, it's a far longer train. It's far worse than it was back then.
It is worse, and a lot of those same ones are in place again.
Right. Yeah, it's like people either haven't learned or we've forgotten. So a lot of this must go back to the twin. I don't want to say twin towers because I think 9/11, but the twin influences of maybe the indoctrination systems in what they call education. We'll call it government schooling, and through the mass media. Those two things together, I think, have led to a real problem. And the other aspect, you try to break through that with alternative media and alternative educational systems, and you can reach out to some and and there's a remnant, and maybe the remnant's growing somewhat, but it's awfully tough. You just get in a conversation. Everybody thinks if you bring these points up, they look at you like, well, you're crazy. Well, we can't do that. We got to just worry about the next election because it's going to be the most important election ever, like the one before that, the one before that, and the one before that.
Most important one of your life, absolutely. Right. If we can only get the House and the Senate, then we can fix everything, and it will be okay.
Yeah, and you say, well, what about what we just had? We just had the House. The Republicans had the House and the Senate and the presidency.
And what happened?
Yeah, more of the same on most of these issues. So then another point that comes up here, though, as I'm referencing it, the other point about 1776 and the idea that, that the Lee Resolution, these 13 colonies aren't of right out to be 13 free and independent states, and so on and so forth. And so political decentralization. is a huge theme, and I know that you're very knowledgeable in that and engaged in that. And we hear it from Jeff Dyson, the Mises Institute, and all the others. We talk about 10th Amendment Center and the other groups that are involved in that. And the Libertarian Party Mises Caucus, I think, is involved in that as well. And then I do wonder. So we talk about the states splitting apart, which might be coming anyway for various reasons, financial or other reasons. And then you say, well, okay, and it doesn't have to be like 50 different states, but Jefferson said there could be several governments on the continent. So maybe you have a Great Lakes Union, and maybe you have a Southeast group or whatever, or maybe some states stand alone. But do you ever wonder that you look at Florida, and I look at Michigan, and I think, and I wonder if you think about this too, Andrew, yeah, so then we would get our independence, but I don't know what would happen, what kind of government would we have given the way our state government is now?
Well, those people that are in the legislature now would probably be among the front runners to be in any type of independent republic government, but it would be up to the people to put in better representatives. Now, we couldn't do it in our present form. Could we do it in a different form? You'd have to say it's highly unlikely. But I look at Florida, for example, because I don't do a lot with national politics. I like state and local because that's where it's at. Because if you control the state, you can pretty much tell Washington on 99% of the things to go fly a kite. But what I look at Florida, I say, well, gosh, it's among the largest economies in the world. It's not as big as California's, but it's bigger than I think 50 other countries. It's a bigger economy. We have between the Air National Guard and the Army National Guard, it's a very formidable military force. We do have water on all sides because we're a peninsula, so you would have to take that into account. But we're also positioned for trade. Having water on all sides also has an upside. We're greatly positioned for trade, and there's nothing that prevents us from entering into defense treaties with Georgia or Alabama or Texas, which is across the Gulf of Mexico. These things could all be worked out. The land that the federal government has within these states for military bases, that can be leased, that can be sold. Before the provocation at Fort Sumter, there were trades being worked out and deals being worked out for other Union forts that were within the southern states. So that could all be done. That's just a matter of negotiations and agreements. As you said, the breakup is coming, whether it's financial, whether it's political, it's coming. But don't you think we would be better off doing it in a controlled environment, talking about it like adults and moving on it in a responsible manner than having it occur chaotically? To me, that would be the least desirable way for it to come about. I believe in secession as strongly as I believe in nullification. Some people don't. But I think when you get back to the founding principles, it is our right to alter and abolish the government that no longer serves our purposes. And we're quickly there. And in the case of Florida, you may even have to subdivide. It may need to be North Florida and South Florida because of the demographics that we have now. But these things can all be worked out. And I firmly believe in the long run, secession saves lives and it saves liberty. And I think giving it a fair shot is worth everybody's while.
Well, I agree with you on that, and there's an interesting aspect to it. If that happens, it reverses a very damaging thing, which is that things become so centralized that for those that want to control the lives of everybody in this country, or use the resources of everybody in this country for various special interest projects, foreign and domestic, it's easy for them to do it. Easier for them to do it in this situation than it would be if we were split up. Then they'd say, well, oh my gosh, now we don't have that one big pot of gold to go after, so to speak. So that I think that the decentralization would be a very positive thing in that regard. So that'll be interesting for sure. Well, Andrew, I want to thank you for your time. This has been a very interesting conversation. I would urge people to go to your Facebook page, the Florida Tenther. You post wonderful things there. Sometimes you get some negative feedback from folks that aren't quite as knowledgeable as you are. Occasionally.
Occasionally, every 45 minutes or so, yeah.
Right, right. But you have a wealth of information, and some of it is just very local Florida things, but other aspects of it are applicable to other parts of the country as well, and that sort of thing. So that's wonderful, and I hope that people do go and look at that. And do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share with us on what you think might be some things that folks might want to do going forward, either with the nullification movement or something else in terms of effective activism to help increase the probability of living in a free society?
Well, for me, the action is in the state. I think the road to liberty for Floridians leads through Tallahassee, and we need to, first of all, understand that we do have a Florida Senate, we do have a Florida House of Representatives, and those people have a great impact on our lives, and we have to stop being fixated by this circus that's going on in D.C. Our state representatives, our state senators work among us, they live among us, they're accessible, and when you have access, you are in a better position to have influence and bring about pressure. And getting caught up in this circus of Washington, D.C. and thinking that's the end all and be all, you just lose so much. So, falling back on the work that Cico Rodriguez and I did with the Florida 10th Amendment Center, I would advise people to get active on a state level, get active on a local level, your Board of County Commissioners, your City Hall. That's where the action is. You control those, and you blunt Washington to such an extent that they're not the influence on your life that they are now.
Well, that's a very good point. And I just wanted to run one idea by you. We have talked about term limits and that sort of thing. And I've often thought that maybe the thing to do would be, rather than have the legislators not go off to the capital city, except for, occasionally for something ceremonial, but for the bulk of the time to have their office in their home district. Mm-hmm. And they could even vote. They don't need to be there now, but by having them all, whether it's in Washington or in any of the state capitals, makes them easy pickings for the special interest groups.
Yeah, the ones in Washington, they got to run every 2 years, so they spend 1 year in and out of the district raising money and shaking hands, and that's when you see them. You see them about 6 weeks every other year. In Michigan, your legislature is full time, right?
Yes, you're one of the few. Yep.
Yeah, see, ours is 60 days, and they're up there for 60 days, and then they're done. They don't call a lot of special sessions. They have these committee weeks. There's 5 of them leading up to the session, where a lot of the work gets done. It's kind of like an unofficial legislative session, but that's where the action is, and. I wish we were like Texas, where they have it every other year. We have 60 days every year. But that's where the action is. And, we do have our state legislators do have offices in the home districts. They are accessible. They work, they're businessmen in the community. They're lawyers in the community. We need to take advantage of that and start leveraging our own pressure on them. Because when they're 800 miles, when they're 4 hours away in Tallahassee, they're out of sight, out of mind, and that's the same thing in Washington. And which is again why I don't really do a lot with national politics. You're familiar with the page. You don't see a lot of Trump stuff on there unless there's a Florida link for the most part, because I believe all the action is in the home. I consider Florida my country. This is my home country. And for me, that's the right attitude to have. I wish more people would have it, but I say you don't have to have that attitude as long as you're more active locally.
Right.
Local is where it's at.
Okay, I agree 100% with that. Now, one last question. So, do you see a risk with if there's too little of a legislative session that we won't be able to repeal the bad stuff? It'll just stay there in place, or do you think that that's not a point to worry about?
I think if there's pressure to repeal something, you can get it repealed. It's it's what kind of pressure can you bear? We have a repeal bill right now for red flag law. It's probably not going to go anywhere because the proper amount of pressure is not being applied. We have a repeal for all of our gun control acts. but the proper amount of pressure is not being applied. And since there was no punishment in a primary or the general election for the majority party, they all were reelected after voting for red flag law. Where's the incentive for them to get rid of these things? They're being rewarded anyway. Right. So that needs to turn around. People need to get more active. They need to know what's going on. I tell people, I wish you knew more about our Florida legislature than you do Nancy Pelosi.
Right. Well, that's a great point, and I think that's a wonderful note to end this on, including your point that we need to mobilize and confront, in a proper manner. But we do need to mobilize and put pressure on. That's Campaign for Liberty was one of the groups. We work Campaign for Liberty here, and that's a big part of what that's about. And I know it's the same thing with the 10th Amendment and the other good groups that are working in these areas. So, Andrew, I want to thank you very much for your time. You've been very gracious. We see your lovely home in the background there, and it's great chatting to you. I hope we can do it again sometime subsequently.
Dennis, thanks for having me. Thanks for thinking of me. And John, thanks for helping me out with my technical glitches. Years ago, I was interviewed by Gary Frankie. He says, "You got Skype?" I said, "What's Skype?" I don't know. I didn't even know what it was. But I thank you very much for thinking of me and having me on.
Well, you're welcome. And folks, yes, we should offer our thanks to Kathy and John Irvine for the wonderful facilities of the Irvine Recording Studio, and to our guest, Andrew Nappi, for his excellent commentary and observations. As I mentioned earlier, you can, of course, you're watching this right now, but if you want to go back and look at it again at some point, or want to see other episodes of Curmudgeonly Conversation or other shows that John Irvine has recorded, they are all at ji1776.com. Our Curmudgeonly Conversation episodes are being downloaded over to the Cerberus Radio Network, thanks to our good friend Suzanne Sherman and her work there, and also will soon be at the Libertarian Institute. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for watching this. Thank you, Andrew Nappi. Thank you, Kathy and John Irvine. And we'll see you all next time. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.